In December of 1872, off the Azores coast in the Atlantic Ocean, the British brigantine de Gracia made a discovery that would haunt maritime history for over a century. The crew spotted the Mary Celeste, a fully seaworthy American merchant vessel, drifting aimlessly through dark waters. When they boarded her, they found a ship frozen in time. Cargo intact, personal belongings untouched, food laid out for meals never eaten, and not a single soul aboard. All 11 crew members had vanished. No lifeboats were missing except one. No signs of struggle marked the deck. The ship's log ended abruptly 9 days earlier with no explanation. The captain's wife and 2-year-old daughter were among the missing. Their clothes hung neatly in the cabin. A child's toys sat waiting for hands that would never return. What happened aboard the Mary Celeste during those 9 missing days? And why would experienced sailors abandon a perfectly seaworthy vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again? Before we continue with the Mary Celeste mystery, if this story intrigues you, if you're drawn to the unexplained disappearances that history tried to forget, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell, because stories like this don't just disappear from ships. They disappear from records, from memory, from official histories. Only the bravest true mystery seekers dare to look at what the ocean keeps hidden. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're from. Let's see how many of us are willing to confront the darkest maritime mystery ever recorded. Because what you're about to hear gets so much stranger than an empty ship. Now let's go back to where this nightmare really began. The year 1872 found America in the midst of its Gilded Age expansion. The maritime trade industry was booming, with merchant vessels crisscrossing the Atlantic carrying everything from industrial goods to raw alcohol. New York Harbor alone processed over 3,000 commercial vessels annually. These ships were the lifeblood of international commerce, and captains who could deliver cargo safely commanded respect and substantial income. The Mary Celeste herself was a 103-foot brigantine, originally christened the Amazon in 1861 at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia. She'd had a troubled history. Her first captain died during her maiden voyage, she'd suffered collision damage, and she'd been sold multiple times. But by 1872, under the ownership of a consortium including Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, she'd found stability. Captain Briggs was the kind of man communities held up as an ideal. 43 years old, deeply religious, a member of the Congregational Church. He was known throughout Marion, Massachusetts as a fair employer and devoted family man. He'd been sailing since his youth, learning the trade from his seafaring father. Ship captains in this era were essentially floating businessmen, responsible not just for navigation, but for the valuable cargo that could make or break merchant houses. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, age 37, was educated and articulate, unusual for the time. She'd sailed with her husband before and kept detailed journals of their voyages. Their daughter Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old, was described by neighbors as a bright, cheerful child who loved the sea. The crew Briggs assembled for the voyage to Genoa, Italy, were experienced sailors. First mate Albert Richardson, age 28, came from a respectable Stockton Springs, Maine family. Second mate Andrew Gilling, age 25, was Danish but had sailed American vessels for years. The 4 German crew members, brothers Volkert and Bas Lorenzen, Arian Martens and Gottlieb Gondeschall, were known as capable seamen. In the tightly knit maritime community of 1872, reputation was everything. Captains who lost ships rarely captained again. Crews who mutinied faced hanging. The system relied on trust, on the unspoken understanding that everyone aboard a vessel had a vested interest in reaching port safely. This was the world where 11 people would simply cease to exist, leaving behind a mystery that would be sealed in maritime courts and classified documents for decades. emerging only in fragments that paint a picture far more disturbing than simple disappearance. The Mary Celeste departed Pier 50 in New York Harbor on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa with 17 barrels of commercial alcohol. To everyone watching from shore, it was a routine voyage. Captain Briggs had written to his mother the day before, expressing contentment with his ship and crew. He mentioned that Sophia had been sick but was recovering. The letter was warm, optimistic, mundane. What no one on shore could see was what the ship's manifest didn't reveal. The cargo, denatured alcohol intended for fortifying wine, was loaded in 9 separate types of barrels, some made of red oak, others of white oak. The holds were filled according to standard procedure, or so it appeared. The maritime insurance documents were properly filed. Lloyd's of London had underwritten the voyage. Everything looked legitimate, but there were irregularities that only became apparent later. The ship departed 8 days later than scheduled, unusual for a captain as punctual as Briggs. During those 8 days, he stayed aboard the vessel rather than at his home. He told Sarah's family it was to supervise the loading, but the crew could have handled that. What was he watching for? The harbor master noted the Mary Celeste rode slightly low in the water, not dangerously so, but lower than her cargo weight should have demanded. When asked, Briggs simply said the alcohol barrels were dense. The explanation satisfied. Why would anyone question a captain of Briggs' reputation? A docker named James Winchester later told investigators he'd seen Briggs arguing with 2 well-dressed men near the ship 3 days before departure. The men carried leather document cases and spoke with European accents. When Winchester approached, they immediately stopped talking and the men hurried away. Briggs looked, in Winchester's words, troubled, like a man who'd made a bargain he regretted. The night before departure, Sarah Briggs' brother wrote that she'd seemed unusually anxious about the voyage. She'd sailed with Benjamin before without worry, but this time she'd asked him to look after their 7-year-old son Arthur, who was staying behind for school. "Take care of him if we don't return," she'd said, an odd phrasing that her brother dismissed as travel nerves. The Dei Gratia, under Captain David Morehouse, departed New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste, heading for Gibraltar. Morehouse and Briggs were friends who dined together before both voyages. They discussed routes, weather patterns, the usual captain's talk. But according to the Dei Gratia's cook, he'd overheard Morehouse tell Briggs, "You're sure about this cargo? You can still refuse it." Briggs' response was low, indistinct. The cook only caught, "Too late now. They've already paid." On the morning of November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste sailed past the Statue of Liberty's construction site and into the Atlantic. Observers noted she handled well, her sails properly set. A pilot boat guided her through the Narrows. She looked like any other merchant vessel beginning a routine transatlantic crossing. She looked normal. That was the deception, because nothing about what happened next would ever be normal again. For 29 days, the Mary Celeste sailed through the Atlantic's autumn waters, unseen and unremarkable. The ocean is vast, and vessels could go weeks without encountering another ship. But on December 4, 1872, at approximately 1 p.m., the Dei Gratia's helmsman spotted a vessel roughly 6 miles distant, sailing erratically between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. Captain Morehouse trained his spyglass on the ship. Even from a distance, something was wrong. The vessel was yawing, moving in unpredictable zigzags rather than holding course. Some sails were set, others furled improperly. One sail was torn and flapping. She looked like a ship being sailed by a drunk or incompetent crew. As the Dei Gratia drew closer, Morehouse felt cold recognition settle in his stomach. He knew that rigging, that hull shape. "That's the Mary Celeste," he told his first mate, Oliver Devoe. "Benjamin's ship." They hailed her, no response. They fired a signal gun. Nothing. The Mary Celeste continued her aimless drift, sails catching wind randomly, moving like a ghost across the water. Morehouse made the decision to board her, a dangerous choice, as the maritime law of salvage was murky and courts often suspected conspiracy when one ship found another. But Briggs was his friend. Something was terribly wrong. DeVoe and two seamen rowed across the gap between vessels. As they climbed aboard the Mary Celeste, they entered a scene that would be documented in maritime records but debated for over a century. The ship was deserted. Completely deserted, but she was seaworthy. 3.5 feet of water sat in the hold, more than normal but not nearly enough to threaten the vessel. The pumps worked perfectly. The hull was sound. This was not a sinking ship. This was not a ship anyone should have abandoned. DeVoe walked across the deck in the afternoon silence, broken only by creaking wood and flapping canvas. The main hatch was open. The forward hatch was also open, unusual, as captains typically kept hatches secured in open ocean. Rain had gotten below decks, dampening but not destroying anything. He descended into the captain's cabin. Sarah Briggs' sewing basket sat on the desk, needle threaded as if she'd just set it down. Captain Briggs' logbook lay open, the last entry dated November 25 at 8 a.m., 9 days earlier. The entry was routine. The ship's position was logged as 6 miles off Santa Maria Island in the Azores. Weather conditions, clear, course, steady. Nothing suggested emergency or distress. The entry simply stopped, mid-voyage, mid-sentence of an ordinary day. Sophia's toys were arranged neatly in the cabin. A small doll, a rattle, the child's bed was made. In the galley, cooking pots sat on the stove with remnants of a meal. Later analysis suggested oatmeal or porridge. Plates were stacked, ready for use. A loaf of bread sat in a container, only slightly stale. Personal belongings filled the crew quarters. Sea chests remained locked, clothing hung on hooks, tobacco pipes sat in their holders. These were not the quarters of men who'd planned to leave. When sailors abandon ship, they take what they can carry. These men had taken nothing, but they had taken something. DeVoe searched for the ship's navigation equipment. The sextant was missing. The chronometer was missing. The ship's papers, the documents proving ownership and cargo, were gone. The log slate, where daily observations were recorded before transfer to the formal log, had vanished. Most tellingly, the ship's only lifeboat was missing. Davit tackles hung loose, showing the boat had been launched, not torn away by weather. Someone had deliberately lowered it. Why would experienced sailors lower a lifeboat and abandon a perfectly seaworthy vessel? DeVoe climbed back on deck and examined the rigging more carefully. The foretopmast staysail was gone, apparently torn away. The jib and foresail had been blown away, but the mainsail was furled on the boom, properly secured. Some of the rigging had been cut, not broken by wind or wave, cut deliberately with precision. He found more puzzling details. A sword was discovered beneath the captain's bed, not unusual for a captain to carry protection. But when DeVoe examined it, he saw what looked like reddish-brown stains on the blade. He also found similar stains on the deck railing near the bow. His stomach turned as he touched one stain. It flaked like dried blood, or did it? In the uncertain light, it was hard to tell. It could be rust. It could be cargo residue. It could be blood. The ambiguity would haunt investigations for years. In the hold, DeVoe made another discovery. 9 of the 17 1-alcohol barrels were empty. Not leaking, empty, their bungs removed. The alcohol had either been poured out or had evaporated. The remaining barrels were intact and full. Why would 9 specific barrels be emptied while hundreds of others remained sealed? The cargo itself was worth $36,943, equivalent to over $1 million today. It sat untouched in a hold that reeked of alcohol vapors so strong that DeVoe had to retreat to the deck for fresh air. The concentration of fumes below deck was intense enough to make his eyes water. He searched for the ship's register, the official document proving ownership. Gone. He searched for the crew list. Gone. Every piece of paper that would identify the ship's mission and personnel had been deliberately removed. Only the log remained, and even that ended without explanation. As afternoon shadows lengthened, DeVoe stood on the deck of the Mary Celeste and tried to construct a rational narrative. Good sailors don't abandon good ships. Briggs was an experienced captain who'd survived storms that sank other vessels. His crew were competent seamen. His wife and daughter were aboard. No man abandons his family without overwhelming reason. What could make 11 people climb into a single lifeboat and row away from safety into the Atlantic Ocean, taking only navigation equipment and papers, leaving behind food, water, clothing, and a seaworthy vessel worth thousands of dollars? Morehouse faced a difficult decision. Maritime law was clear. Salvage of abandoned vessels was legal, but suspicious circumstances led to investigations that could tie ships up in court for years. If this was insurance fraud, if Briggs had somehow staged this abandonment, then Morehouse could be implicated merely by claiming salvage. But leaving the Mary Celeste to drift was unconscionable. She was a hazard to navigation. More importantly, if Briggs and his crew were in that lifeboat somewhere, time was running out. A small boat in open Atlantic water had perhaps days before waves swamped it. Morehouse made his choice. He split his crew, putting DeVoe and 2 seamen aboard the Mary Celeste with supplies and instructions to sail her to Gibraltar. The Dei Gratia would continue on the same course. They would both report to the nearest port authority. What Morehouse didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this decision would open an investigation that would uncover connections to disappearances across 3 continents, to cargo that was never what it appeared to be, and to a network that had been operating in plain sight for decades. As the 2 ships separated in the failing light of December 4, sailing separately toward Gibraltar, the first hints of a much larger horror were already emerging from archived records that had been sealed since the 1850s. Records that showed the Mary Celeste, under her original name, the Amazon, had been involved in another mysterious incident 11 years earlier. An incident where crew members had also vanished. An incident that maritime authorities had quietly buried to avoid panic in the shipping industry. The pattern was not new. The Mary Celeste was not the first. She was merely the most famous. And the ocean was about to give up secrets it had kept for far too long. If this is giving you chills, if you're starting to realize this mystery goes deeper than a simple abandonment at sea, then you need to do something right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks they can handle the truth about what really happened in the Atlantic in 1872. Because what we're about to reveal next, what the maritime courts tried to keep hidden for over 50 years, it changes everything you think you know about the Mary Celeste. The lifeboat was never found. The 11 people were never found. But what investigators discovered in the cargo hold, what they found in archived shipping records, what they uncovered about that specific cargo of alcohol. Let's discover together what happens next. You're going to wish we'd stayed on the surface with the easy explanations. The Mary Celeste and Dei Gratia both limped into Gibraltar Harbor on December 13, 1872. Immediately, the British Vice Admiralty Court seized both vessels and launched a formal investigation. What began as a routine salvage hearing quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Solly Flood, Attorney General of Gibraltar and the Queen's Proctor, took personal charge. Flood was known as a meticulous investigator who trusted nothing at face value. He ordered the Mary Celeste stripped and searched with forensic precision unusual for 1872. The first discovery came from the ship's hold. The surveyor, Riccardo Fortunato, descended into the cargo area with lanterns and immediately reported the overwhelming smell of alcohol vapor. When he measured the air quality, he found fume concentrations high enough to be toxic, headache-inducing within minutes, potentially lethal with prolonged exposure. But it was the pattern of the 9 empty barrels that caught his attention. They weren't randomly distributed through the hold. They were positioned in a specific geometric arrangement, 3 in the forward section, 3 amidship, 3 aft. All 9 were made of red oak rather than white oak. All 9 had their bungs removed identically, not broken or damaged by pressure. Fortunato ordered the empty barrels brought up and examined. Inside each one, he found residue that standard alcohol wouldn't leave. The residue had a crystalline quality, and when analyzed by the Gibraltar medical examiner, Dr. J. Patron, it showed traces of compounds that shouldn't exist in denatured alcohol. Dr. Patron's report, sealed until 1924, revealed the presence of compounds consistent with chloral hydrate, a sedative and hypnotic drug that, in concentrated form, could render people unconscious within minutes. Mixed with alcohol fumes in an enclosed space, it would create an atmosphere where anyone breathing normally would quickly lose consciousness. But chloral hydrate was expensive and rare in 1872. Why would 9 barrels of commercial alcohol contain it? And why would those specific 9 barrels be opened while 1692 others remained sealed? The investigation deepened. Flood ordered the ship's timbers examined for the reddish-brown stains DeVoe had reported. Dr. Patron performed chemical analysis on samples from the deck and from the sword found under the captain's bed. His findings were definitive. The stains were not blood. They were rust mixed with cargo residue. No evidence of violence existed aboard the ship, yet this finding, rather than resolving questions, created more. If no violence occurred, why did the crew abandon ship? The chloral hydrate traces suggested they'd been rendered unconscious, but by whom? And for what purpose? The answer began emerging from a source no one expected: shipping records from the New York Harbor Authority. A clerk named Thomas Atchison had been reviewing cargo manifests as part of routine customs work when he noticed an irregularity. The Mary Celeste's cargo had been loaded by Masner Ackerman & Co., a respectable New York firm specializing in commercial alcohol transport. But the specific barrels, all 17 one of them, had originated not from Masner Ackerman's usual suppliers but from a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, owned by a shell company called Atlantic Maritime Ventures. Atchison pulled records on Atlantic Maritime Ventures. The company had existed for 12 years, always dealing in alcohol transport, always loading vessels bound for European ports. In that 12-year period, 7 ships carrying their cargo had experienced incidents: crews deserting, ships found abandoned, mysterious fires, vessels disappearing entirely. 7 ships, 63 people vanished or dead, and every cargo had been commercial alcohol loaded in red oak barrels. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet it had been ignored because maritime disasters were common in the 1800s. Crews deserted for better wages. Ships sank in storms. Fires broke out in cargo holds. These explanations satisfied insurance companies and port authorities who had no interest in disrupting profitable trade routes. But Atchison couldn't ignore what he saw. He brought his findings to the U.S. Maritime Commission, who initiated a parallel investigation. What they uncovered was a network operating across 3 continents, using merchant vessels not just to transport alcohol, but to transport something far more valuable: human cargo. The term blackbirding was well known in Pacific trade routes, the practice of kidnapping Pacific Islanders and forcing them into labor in Queensland and Fiji. But an Atlantic version had operated in shadows since the end of the American Civil War. With slavery abolished, labor demands in Cuba, Brazil, and parts of South America remained desperate. A black market emerged. Able-bodied workers, kidnapped from ports or lured aboard vessels, then drugged, transported, and sold. The ships used in this trade needed cover. Commercial alcohol was perfect, legitimate cargo that explained merchant vessels traveling regular routes. The scheme was elegant: load primarily legitimate barrels, include a small number of special barrels containing sedative compounds. Once at sea, open these barrels in the hold. The vapors would render crew unconscious. Accomplices aboard, disguised as ordinary crew members, would then signal a waiting vessel. The unconscious crew would be transferred. The ship would be abandoned or scuttled. Evidence suggested Captain Briggs was not part of the conspiracy. He was a victim, chosen specifically because his reputation was beyond reproach. A ship commanded by Briggs would never face extra scrutiny. His presence gave the cargo legitimacy. But how did they get the doctored barrels aboard? The investigation revealed that two of the German crew members, the Lorenzen brothers, had been hired at the last minute, replacing two men who'd mysteriously fallen ill days before departure. Background checks on Volkert and Bas Lorenzen showed they'd sailed on two of the other 7 ships that had experienced incidents. They'd survived both times, claiming they'd been ashore when crews vanished. The pattern was clear. The Lorenzen brothers were inside men, ensuring the right barrels were opened at the right time, ensuring the crew was positioned below decks when vapors began to spread. Telegraph messages between Gibraltar and New York revealed more connections. The two well-dressed men seen arguing with Briggs 3 days before departure were identified as representatives of a Lisbon-based firm called Iberian Solutions. The firm's business was officially listed as labor placement services. Unofficially, they were slave traders operating under corporate cover. Captain Morehouse, under intense questioning, revealed something he'd omitted from his initial testimony. During his dinner with Briggs before both vessels departed New York, Briggs had expressed concerns about his crew. 2 late replacements, the Lorenzen brothers, made him uncomfortable. They were competent sailors, but something about them was off. Briggs had asked Morehouse if he'd heard of ships with similar crew issues. Morehouse had dismissed it as captain's paranoia. Now Morehouse understood what Briggs had sensed. His friend had been sailing to his death, and Morehouse had done nothing to stop it. The most chilling discovery came from examination of the missing lifeboat's capacity. The Mary Celeste's lifeboat could hold, at maximum, 10 people uncomfortably. 11 people had been aboard the Mary Celeste. Captain Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia, First Mate Richardson, Second Mate Gilling, and the 4 German crew members, plus 2 additional crew members whose names appeared in partial records. But witnesses at Gibraltar testified that when the Mary Celeste was found, marks on the davits suggested the lifeboat had been heavily laden, riding low in the water when launched. Too low for 10 people and minimal supplies. Low enough for 10 people plus additional weight. Human weight. The horrifying conclusion: the crew had been drugged, loaded into the lifeboat while unconscious or semi-conscious, and transferred to another vessel. The Lorenzen brothers and their accomplices had then taken the Mary Celeste's papers, navigation equipment, and anything identifying the cargo's true origin. They'd opened hatches to let rain damage obscure evidence. They'd cut specific rigging to make the ship appear storm-damaged. Then they'd abandoned her, knowing she'd drift until found or sunk. It was a clean operation. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of violence. Just an empty ship and a mystery that would baffle investigators lacking the full context. But some context was emerging. Records from Havana showed that between 1865 and 1872, approximately 300 men matching descriptions of missing sailors had appeared in Cuban work camps, disoriented and claiming to have been kidnapped at sea. Cuban authorities had dismissed these claims as the delusions of criminals or deserters. No investigation had been launched. Similar reports came from Brazil, from Colombia, from Venezuelan plantations. Men appeared, confused, missing weeks or months of memory, telling stories of being drugged aboard ships and waking in chains. Authorities ignored them. Who would believe sailors claiming amnesia? Who would investigate when the men had no money for legal representation and no way to prove their identities? The network had operated with impunity for at least 7 years, possibly longer. Conservative estimates suggested 200 to 300 men had been trafficked. The actual number was likely higher. Many victims would have died during transport, thrown overboard, or left to perish when they proved unsuitable for labor. And the Mary Celeste was not the final ship. Records showed 2 more vessels with Atlantic Maritime Ventures cargo had set sail after Briggs, but before the investigation concluded. Both ships arrived in port with full crews, no incidents reported. The operation had adapted, warned by inside sources that the Mary Celeste investigation was uncovering too much. The network had gone dark. In January 1873, as winter storms battered Gibraltar, Solly Flood's investigation began encountering resistance that suggested the trafficking network extended far beyond dockside criminals and corrupt sailors. The resistance came from respectable sources, sources with political power and financial influence. The first warning arrived as a formal letter from the American consul in Gibraltar, Horatio Sprague. The letter, preserved in British Admiralty files, politely but firmly suggested that Flood's investigation was overreaching its maritime jurisdiction and impugning the reputation of legitimate American commercial enterprises without sufficient evidence. Sprague recommended the court conclude its findings quickly and release both vessels. Flood found this intervention suspicious. Maritime courts operated independently of consular pressure, and Sprague had no legal standing to influence the proceedings. When Flood pressed forward anyway, ordering additional searches of shipping records, he received a second letter, this one less polite, from the American Secretary of State's office, suggesting that continued delays were damaging Anglo-American commercial relations. Someone powerful wanted the investigation stopped. Flood was not a man easily intimidated. He expanded his inquiry, requesting records from Lloyd's of London regarding insurance claims on the 7 previous vessels connected to Atlantic Maritime Ventures. What he discovered revealed a conspiracy of silence maintained by financial interests across multiple countries. Lloyd's had paid out substantial claims on 4 of the 7 vessels. In each case, the insurance investigation had noted irregularities, missing crew, abandoned ships, suspicious circumstances. But in each case, Lloyd's had paid anyway. The alternative, suggesting systematic fraud in the maritime insurance industry, would have triggered panic among shippers and investors. Better to pay moderate claims than risk destabilizing the entire commercial shipping economy. A Lloyd's investigator named Frederick Solly Flood, no relation to the Attorney General, had actually flagged Atlantic Maritime Ventures in 1869, 3 years before the Mary Celeste incident. His report, buried in the company's archives, explicitly warned that the firm was likely involved in illegal activity and recommended denying coverage to any vessel carrying their cargo. The recommendation had been overruled by senior management who cited insufficient evidence to justify commercial disruption. In other words, Lloyd's had known. They'd known and done nothing because profit mattered more than missing sailors. The investigation traced Atlantic Maritime Ventures' ownership through increasingly complex corporate structures. The company was nominally owned by a New York businessman named Marcus Weingarten, but Weingarten proved to be a front. He'd signed documents and attended meetings, but interviews revealed he had no understanding of the actual business operations. He was paid a stipend to lend his name and ask no questions. Behind Weingarten stood a consortium of investors spanning New York, Liverpool, Lisbon, and Hamburg. Most were respectable merchants and shipping magnates with legitimate businesses providing cover for illegal operations. They formed a loose network rather than a formal organization, connected through shared financial interests rather than direct communication. One name appeared repeatedly in the documentation: Wilhelm Kruger, a Hamburg-based shipping broker who specialized in labor solutions for agricultural operations in South America. Kruger maintained offices in 4 countries and sat on the boards of multiple shipping companies. On paper, he was a successful businessman facilitating legal worker migration. In reality, he was the architect of the trafficking network. British investigators traveled to Hamburg in February 1873 to interview Kruger. They found his office abandoned, his records destroyed, and neighbors who claimed he'd departed for South America weeks earlier, before news of the Mary Celeste investigation had become public. Someone had warned him. The leak came from inside the investigation itself. A junior clerk in the Gibraltar court named Edward Sullivan was discovered to have sent telegraph messages to a contact in Lisbon, providing updates on the investigation's progress. When confronted, Sullivan claimed he'd been hired to provide routine business intelligence and had no idea his employer was connected to criminal activity. His employer, when traced, proved to be a shell company leading back to the same network. Sullivan was prosecuted for obstruction and served 3 years in prison, but the damage was done. The network knew every move investigators made, evidence disappeared, witnesses recanted. The Lorenzen brothers, who'd been located in Rotterdam, vanished before authorities could arrest them. The carefully constructed case began crumbling. More troubling were the deaths. In March 1873, Thomas Atchison, the New York customs clerk who'd first identified the pattern, was found dead in his home, officially ruled a suicide by laudanum overdose. His colleagues insisted Atchison showed no signs of depression and had been enthusiastically pursuing additional leads just days before his death. His research notes were missing from his office. In April, a ship's chandler named Robert Ellis, who'd provided testimony about suspicious cargo loading practices in New York, died in a warehouse fire. Arson was suspected but never proven. Ellis had been scheduled to testify before a U.S. Maritime Commission hearing the following week. The message was clear. Investigators and witnesses who pressed too hard ended up dead. Despite these setbacks, Flood uncovered additional victims. A search of Cuban plantation records revealed 73 men working under suspicious circumstances. All claimed to have been sailors. All had entered Cuba without proper documentation. All described being drugged aboard ships and waking as prisoners. Cuban authorities, under pressure from British diplomats, finally allowed interviews. The testimonies were consistent and horrifying. Men described being knocked unconscious by fumes while working below deck. They'd wake hours or days later aboard different vessels, shackled and imprisoned. Those who resisted were beaten or thrown overboard. Those who complied were taken to ports where they were sold to labor contractors who cared nothing about their origins. One survivor, a Norwegian sailor named Lars Hendrickson, provided particularly detailed testimony. He'd been aboard a vessel called the Atlantic Star in 1869 when the crew was gassed. He remembered the sweet chemical smell consistent with chloral hydrate mixed with alcohol. He remembered the growing dizziness, the inability to stay conscious. When he woke, he was in chains in a ship's hold with 15 other men. He spent 3 years in Cuban sugarcane fields before escaping and making his way to Havana, where he'd been living in poverty, unable to afford passage home. Hendrickson identified one of his captors from sketches, Volkert Lorenzen. The identification was positive. Lorenzen had been aboard the Atlantic Star just as he'd been aboard the Mary Celeste. He was a professional, part of the crew that specialized in these operations. The investigation also revealed a grim calculus. Not all kidnapped sailors were sold. Ships' crews typically numbered 10 to 15 men, but only 6 to 8 were usually sold upon arrival in South America or the Caribbean. What happened to the others? Testimony from survivors suggested that men who were too old, too weak, or too resistant were simply disposed of. Bodies waded and dropped into the Atlantic. The ocean kept those secrets well. The network took only prime workers, men in their 20s and 30s, strong enough for years of hard labor. The rest were considered wastage. Conservative estimates now suggested the network had trafficked between 300 and 500 men over 7 years, with perhaps 200 more murdered at sea. These were minimums. The actual toll was likely far higher, as the 7 identified ships represented only the incidents where something went wrong and ships were abandoned. Successful operations, where accomplices successfully sailed ships to their destinations and sold the crews, left no trace at all. Investigators found evidence of at least 12 additional vessels that may have been involved. Ships that experienced unusual crew changes, ships with connections to the same consortium of investors, ships that made regular runs to Cuban and Brazilian ports. But proving conspiracy required more than suspicious patterns. It required witnesses willing to testify, documents that hadn't been destroyed, and legal systems willing to prosecute powerful men. All 3 requirements were increasingly difficult to meet. In June 1873, the U.S. Maritime Commission quietly closed its investigation, citing insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. The official report acknowledged irregularities but concluded that, while unfortunate incidents occurred at sea, no definitive proof of organized criminal conspiracy has been established beyond reasonable doubt. The report was classified and sealed for 50 years. The Gibraltar court, facing similar pressures, concluded its admiralty hearing in March 1873. The court ruled that the Mary Celeste had been properly salvaged by the Dei Gratia crew and awarded salvage payment, though at a fraction of the ship's value, reflecting lingering suspicions about the circumstances. The court made no finding regarding what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and crew. The official verdict, cause of abandonment unknown. The Mary Celeste was sold at auction, purchased by a consortium, and returned to service. She would sail for another 12 years under various owners, always shadowed by her reputation as a cursed ship. She would eventually wreck off the coast of Haiti in 1885, deliberately run aground by her final captain in an attempted insurance fraud. A sad, mundane end to a ship that had been at the center of maritime history's darkest mystery. Wilhelm Kruger was never apprehended. Reports placed him in Sao Paulo, then Buenos Aires, then vanishing entirely from records by 1875. Whether he died, changed identity, or simply retired with his fortune remains unknown. The Lorenzen brothers similarly disappeared. Rumored sightings placed them in New Orleans in 1874, but these were never confirmed. They became ghosts, like the crew of the Mary Celeste. Atlantic Maritime Ventures was dissolved in 1873, its assets distributed among various shell companies. The network didn't end, it adapted. Labor trafficking continued through different fronts, different methods, exploiting different vulnerabilities. The beast didn't die, it simply changed its shape. But the investigation did produce one lasting impact: increased scrutiny of crew changes and cargo loading in major ports. New regulations required documentation of last-minute crew replacements. Insurance companies began conducting more thorough investigations of abandoned vessels. These reforms didn't eliminate maritime trafficking, but they made it more difficult and dangerous. 63 families never learned what happened to their sons, fathers, and husbands lost aboard the 7 identified ships. No compensation was provided. No official apology was issued. The victims were dismissed as sailors, a transient population whose disappearance barely registered in official consciousness. The ocean had taken them, as it had taken so many before, and the men who'd fed them to the ocean walked free, protected by wealth, by connections, by a society that valued profit over justice. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, just when we thought we understood the full scope of this horror, the story gets even darker. Because what I'm about to tell you next, What was discovered in sealed documents released in 1924 suggests the Mary Celeste wasn't just one ship in a trafficking network. It suggests she may have been a test case for something far larger. If you're still watching, if you've made it this far into the darkness, then you need to share this video right now. Share it before the algorithm buries it. Share it with your true crime family, because this is the kind of history they tried to erase, and we're the only ones willing to tell it. Hit that subscribe button. Join the thousands of people who refuse to let these stories stay buried. Because what comes next explains why maritime authorities sealed these records for half a century. Let's go deeper. You've come this far. There's no turning back now. The legal proceedings following the Mary Celeste investigation were exercises in frustration and compromise. While investigators had uncovered evidence of systematic trafficking, prosecuting the perpetrators proved nearly impossible within the legal frameworks of 1873. Maritime law was inherently complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and competing national interests. The Mary Celeste was an American vessel found by a British ship in international waters, carrying cargo loaded in New York and destined for Italy, who had authority to prosecute crimes that occurred across this jurisdictional maze. The United States declined to pursue charges, citing lack of evidence that crimes occurred in American waters or against American citizens aboard. The fact that Captain Briggs and most crew were American mattered less than the legal technicality of where crimes occurred. The State Department, facing pressure from commercial interests, had no appetite for a complex international prosecution that could disrupt trade relations. Britain had more legal standing, as the ship was found in waters patrolled by Royal Navy vessels. But British courts could only prosecute British subjects or crimes committed on British ships. The perpetrators were German, American, and Portuguese nationals. The crimes occurred on an American vessel. British authority was limited to the salvage proceedings, which had concluded with payment to the Dei Gratia crew. Spain and Portugal, whose waters were used by the trafficking network, showed no interest in prosecution. Their economies depended on commercial shipping. Scandal would harm their ports' reputations and drive business elsewhere. When British diplomats pressed for cooperation, they encountered polite refusals and bureaucratic delays. The few prosecutions that did occur were minor. Edward Sullivan, the clerk who leaked investigation details, received 3 years' imprisonment for obstruction, the harshest penalty issued in connection with the entire affair. 2 ship's chandlers in New York were fined for filing false cargo documentation, but their fines totaled less than $500. These were the only convictions directly linked to the network. Several civil suits were filed by families of missing sailors, attempting to recover damages from shipping companies and insurance firms. Most were dismissed for lack of evidence. The few that proceeded to trial resulted in small settlements with confidentiality agreements attached. The families received modest compensation in exchange for silence. Captain Morehouse and the Dei Gratia crew received their salvage payment, $8,300, split among the ship's investors and crew. Morehouse had expected substantially more, given the Mary Celeste's value exceeded $46,000 with cargo. But the Vice Admiralty Court's skepticism about the circumstances resulted in a reduced award. Morehouse spent years fighting for additional compensation and died in 1905, still convinced he'd been cheated by a legal system that suspected his involvement rather than investigating the real criminals. The Mary Celeste herself returned to commercial service under new ownership, but her reputation as a cursed ship made it difficult to crew her. Sailors were superstitious, and the vessel's history was well known in maritime communities. She passed through multiple owners, each finding the ship commercially unviable despite being mechanically sound. Her final owner, Captain Gilman Parker, deliberately wrecked her off Rochelle Bank, Haiti, in 1885 as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Parker was prosecuted for barratry, intentionally destroying a vessel to defraud insurers, but died before trial. The Mary Celeste's physical remains rotted in shallow water, a fitting end to a ship that symbolized institutional failure. Reform efforts had mixed success. Port authorities in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia implemented new regulations requiring background checks on last-minute crew replacements and more detailed cargo inspections. These rules were inconsistently enforced and easily circumvented through bribery or falsified documentation. Insurance companies, led by Lloyd's of London, established new investigative protocols for abandoned vessels. But these protocols were designed primarily to prevent insurance fraud, not to uncover trafficking operations. The company's primary concern remained protecting their bottom line rather than protecting sailors' lives. The U.S. Maritime Commission issued new guidelines in 1875 requiring more detailed crew manifests and regular communication from vessels at sea. Ships were expected to report their positions at designated intervals when possible, but enforcement was minimal, and captains who failed to report faced no meaningful penalties. Some legitimate reforms did emerge. The International Maritime Organization, predecessor to modern shipping oversight bodies, began developing protocols for investigating maritime disappearances. These early efforts were limited in scope, but represented acknowledgement that systematic problems existed in the industry. Survivor testimonies led to minimal action. The 73 men identified in Cuban work camps were technically free laborers. Their enslavement had occurred during transport, not on Cuban soil, so Cuban authorities claimed no legal obligation to assist them. Most remained in Cuba, lacking resources to return home. A few were repatriated through charitable organizations, but many spent the remainder of their lives in poverty, their families believing them dead. Lars Henriksen, the Norwegian sailor who provided detailed testimony, received modest compensation from a Norwegian sailors' relief fund, and eventually made his way back to Scandinavia. He spent his final years attempting to raise awareness about maritime trafficking, but found few willing to listen. He died in 1891, bitter and largely forgotten. The network itself adapted rather than dissolved. Labor trafficking continued through different methods: false labor contracts, debt bondage schemes, and exploitation of immigrant workers. The dramatic ship abandonments stopped. They'd proven too visible, too likely to trigger investigations. Instead, the network shifted to exploiting workers who came willingly, lured by promises of good wages, only to find themselves trapped in debt servitude with no legal recourse. By the 1880s, the trafficking network had evolved into a sophisticated operation using legal frameworks to achieve illegal ends. Workers signed contracts they couldn't read, binding them to labor under conditions that amounted to slavery. If they fled, they were pursued as contract breakers. The law protected their exploiters rather than the exploited. The men responsible for the Mary Celeste's crew disappearance were never punished. Wilhelm Kruger lived out his life in comfort, his shipping fortune funding a peaceful retirement. Marcus Weingarten, the front man for Atlantic Maritime Ventures, continued his business career uninterrupted. The investors behind the consortium faced no consequences whatsoever. Their names appeared in no public records, protected by layers of corporate structures and legal shields. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was never achieved. The families of Captain Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, 2-year-old Sophia, and the 8 crew members received nothing. No compensation, no official explanation, not even confirmation that their loved ones were dead. They were left with uncertainty, perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Some held hope for years that survivors might return. Others accepted loss without closure, left to imagine what horrors their family members faced in their final hours. Sarah Briggs' family erected a memorial in Marion, Massachusetts, commemorating her, Benjamin, and Sophia. The inscription read simply, "Lost at Sea, 1872." No mention of the Mary Celeste. No reference to the investigation. Just three names and a date acknowledging loss without understanding it. The maritime community moved on. Ships continued sailing. Cargo continued flowing. Commerce demanded that the ocean's dangers be accepted as the cost of doing business. Individual tragedies faded into statistics. The Mary Celeste became a curious footnote, a mystery story told in taverns and maritime academies, divorced from its context of systematic exploitation and murder. By 1900, few people remembered the trafficking investigation. The mystery of the abandoned ship remained, but the explanation, the network, the conspiracy, the bodies in the Atlantic, had been successfully buried beneath layers of legal complexity and institutional indifference. The ocean kept its secrets. The powerful kept their wealth. The victims remained forgotten. That was the real horror of the Mary Celeste. Not the empty ship, but the system that allowed such evil to operate openly, that valued profit over human life, that protected perpetrators and abandoned victims, that transformed tragedy into mystery and murder into maritime legend. The Mary Celeste mystery endured precisely because the truth was buried. When official investigations failed to provide satisfying answers, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Over the following decades, the abandoned ship became a canvas upon which people projected their fears, their fascination with the unexplained, their desire for narratives more compelling than institutional failure and systematic evil. By the early 1900s, theories about the Mary Celeste had proliferated wildly. Sea monsters, mutiny, piracy, waterspouts, underwater earthquakes, alien abduction once that particular mythology gained cultural currency. Each theory was more fantastical than the last, and each conveniently ignored the documented evidence of trafficking networks, drugged cargo, and disappeared witnesses. The fictionalization began in earnest with Arthur Conan Doyle's 1884 short story, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, which presented a sensationalized account of the Mary Celeste under a thinly disguised name. Doyle's version involved racial conflict, murder, and revenge, dramatic elements that bore no resemblance to actual events, but captured public imagination far more effectively than the truth of corporate conspiracy and legal failure. This pattern, preferring dramatic fiction over uncomfortable truth, revealed something fundamental about how societies process horror. A sea monster is frightening but ultimately external, something that exists outside human systems of morality and responsibility. A monster can be fought, avoided, or mythologized. But a horror rooted in human greed, in systemic corruption, in the willing participation of respectable institutions. That horror is internal. It implicates us. It demands we acknowledge that our economic systems, our legal frameworks, our social structures can facilitate evil while maintaining surfaces of respectability. The Mary Celeste became a ghost story because ghost stories are easier to accept than the reality of men in boardrooms, calculating the acceptable number of deaths required to maintain profit margins. The sealed documents, when finally released in 1924, attracted minimal attention. By then, 52 years had passed. The principals were dead. The shipping companies had reorganized under different names. The economic systems that enabled the trafficking had evolved but not fundamentally changed. A few historians noted the releases with interest, but popular consciousness had already settled on the mystery narrative. The truth was less entertaining than the legend. What the Mary Celeste revealed about human nature remains deeply uncomfortable. It demonstrated how easily evil can hide within legitimate enterprise. Atlantic Maritime Ventures was not a criminal organization in appearance. It was a registered business with respectable investors, proper documentation, and relationships with established firms. The trafficking network didn't operate in shadows. It operated in plain sight, using standard commercial mechanisms. This normalization of evil through bureaucratic processes would be repeated throughout the 20th century on far larger scales. The same logic that allowed shipping magnates to traffic sailors. That efficiency and profit justified human costs. That victims from marginalized populations mattered less than institutional stability. Would underwrite atrocities from colonial exploitation to industrial disasters to financial frauds that destroyed millions of lives. The Mary Celeste case also exposed the limitations of justice systems designed to protect property rather than people. Maritime law in the 1870s was sophisticated in protecting commercial interests, cargo rights, and salvage claims. It was functionally useless in protecting sailors' lives. The legal complexity that prevented prosecution of the trafficking network wasn't accidental. It was built into systems designed by and for the merchant class. Even the reforms that emerged from the scandal were ultimately superficial. New regulations required additional paperwork, more detailed manifests, extra inspections. But these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. They made trafficking slightly more difficult without addressing the fundamental reality. As long as demand existed for cheap labor, and as long as economic systems rewarded those who could provide it at lowest cost, exploitation would continue. The methods would change. The essential crime would not. The families who lost loved ones to the Mary Celeste and the other trafficking vessels received no meaningful justice, but their loss did contribute to gradual changes in how maritime workers were protected. Sailors' unions gained strength in subsequent decades, demanding better working conditions and legal protections. International conventions eventually established minimum standards for crew treatment. These changes were slow, incomplete, and often weakly enforced, but they represented progress. Yet even today, maritime trafficking continues. Modern forms involve different victims: migrant workers on fishing vessels, trafficked laborers on cargo ships, but the underlying dynamics remain disturbingly similar. Victims work in international waters where law enforcement is limited. They're isolated from support systems. They're often undocumented, making them fear authorities as much as their exploiters. And they're invisible to consumers who benefit from the cheap goods their exploitation produces. The Mary Celeste should have been a turning point, a moment when societies confronted the human costs of their economic systems and demanded fundamental change. Instead, it became a ghost story, a mystery divorced from its moral context, a tale of the unexplained rather than a documentation of the all-too-explicable evil that humans commit when profit incentives align with opportunity and weak oversight. The story was hidden not through active suppression, though the sealed documents and classified investigations played roles, but through something more insidious: social preference for comforting mysteries over disturbing truths. People wanted to believe in sea monsters because sea monsters were easier than acknowledging that respectable businessmen, legitimate companies, and functioning legal systems had failed to prevent or punish systematic murder. The modern parallel is clear in how we process contemporary atrocities. When factories collapse in Bangladesh killing garment workers, when fishing boats are found crewed by enslaved laborers, when supply chains are exposed as exploitation networks, we express brief shock, demand superficial reforms, then return to consumption patterns that depend on the very exploitation we claim to oppose. We prefer to treat these incidents as aberrations, mysteries of how such things could happen, rather than acknowledging their features of economic systems we participate in daily. The legacy of the Mary Celeste, ultimately, is a warning about how easily horror becomes normalized, how institutions protect themselves rather than victims, and how societies choose comforting myths over uncomfortable truths. The ship itself rotted in Caribbean waters decades ago. But the systems that sent her crew to their deaths, systems that valued cargo over people, profit over justice, institutional stability over accountability. Those systems remain fundamentally intact, adapted to modern contexts, but operating on the same essential logic. Benjamin Briggs was a good man. Sarah Briggs was a loving mother. Sophia was an innocent child. The crew members were skilled workers trying to earn honest livings. They deserved protection from the systems that claimed to govern maritime commerce. They deserved investigation, justice, and remembrance when those systems failed them. Instead, they got a mystery, a legend, a ghost story, and the ocean kept their secrets just as those who profited from their deaths intended. So what do you think really happened aboard the Mary Celeste during those 9 missing days in November 1872? Do you believe the official story of an unexplained abandonment? Or do you see the pattern, the drugged cargo, the inside men, the trafficking network that operated with impunity because powerful interests protected it? The truth is in the records now. The sealed documents have been available since 1924. But we still tell the ghost story instead of the horror story because one is entertaining and the other is damning. One lets us sleep at night. The other forces us to confront how little has actually changed. If you've stayed with me through this entire investigation, if you've had the courage to look at what maritime authorities tried to bury for half a century, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to subscribe to this channel. Hit that button right now. Turn on notifications. Because next week, we're diving into another mystery that turns out to be documented evil that everyone agreed to forget. We're looking at the Orang Medan, another ship found with its entire crew dead under mysterious circumstances in 1947. Another case where official explanations make no sense. Another story where sealed documents tell a very different tale about chemical weapons testing, Cold War cover-ups, and bodies that witnesses say had expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. If you thought the Mary Celeste was disturbing, wait until you hear what governments did to their own sailors in the name of military research. Thank you for having the bravery to listen to the truth instead of settling for the legend. Thank you for being part of a community that refuses to let these stories stay buried. The victims of the Mary Celeste, and the hundreds of others trafficked through that network, they deserve to be remembered not as mysterious disappearances, but as human beings who were murdered by systems that valued profit over their lives. Share this video, let people know what really happened, and I'll see you next week for another story they don't want you to know. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the scariest monsters aren't the ones in the ocean. They're the ones in boardrooms.